Okay, guys. Let's just have a little chat about who John was. I don't know if you've been watching The Chosen. It was very popular a year or two ago. Um, well, aside from questions about whether or not it was financed by the Mormons, alarm bells. Um, I found that a lot of it was very unbiblical. For example, they portrayed the disciples as drinking, gambling, fighting, shifty characters who were always sort of like trying to hide things from their wives and all that. In John's Gospel, in John chapter 1, you find out that a couple of the disciples were actually already being rabbinically trained by John the Baptist. That was another thing they did in the Chosen, was they found, they made out that the disciples didn't know who John the Baptist was, which is totally ridiculous. I mean, you know, we sometimes get this idea that the disciples were called out of the blue by Jesus, and they just dropped their nets and followed a complete stranger. Nothing could be further from the truth. They knew each other from childhood. They grew up in the same area, and it's significant that actually only Judas came from a different area. The others were all from Galilee, and they probably knew each other, even if they were tax collectors and all the rest of it, but they all knew each other. It's a small community, and we forget exactly how small it was. Okay, now in the notes you'll see here, this is in A, the introduction, who was John. Okay, I've got a few notes here. Not only was he a fisherman, he was also a good businessman. They had a business with hired men, so they were obviously well-to-do people. Also, it seems that John, if he wrote the gospel himself, we're assuming that he didn't use a secretary. He might have used a scribe to write it down while he spoke. But he had an incredible knowledge of the Old Testament. He was obviously highly educated. At least the writing style of the gospel is very good. So he was educated more than even most Jews, who were all well educated. And also, he may have been training for the high priesthood, for the priesthood, because he was known at the high priest's house. He was able to speak to the security guards and get Peter in. So you can't do that unless you're known to the high priest. And people have suggested, well, maybe he used to sell fish to them or whatever else. Maybe he was. Maybe he was a businessman. But, it's more likely somebody who was actually training as a priest. Okay. Most of all, of course, there was the incredible knowledge of the Old Testament that comes through the text, in particular in relation to the priesthood itself, So, John was obviously a little bit more than just a roughneck fisherman. They're often portrayed as being uneducated because they're called unschooled in Acts, and that should actually mean they're not university trained. Okay, they weren't trained by the Pharisees to their standards, but they were obviously highly trained, and they were, we talk about them like they were somehow ignorant fishermen. Well, even thick old Peter could quote a whole chapter of Joel on the day of Pentecost, so they obviously knew a thing or two. Now, James and John were brothers, and also, of course, with Peter, they sort of formed the inner circle of the disciples. There were 12 disciples, but there were the three who saw certain things. For example, they saw the transfiguration, they saw the raising of the little girl, Talitha Kum. They went with Jesus in Gethsemane, but actually none of that is in John's Gospel, I should add. Talitha Kum is, of course, in the Synoptics. All right. It's also interesting to notice that John and James, in fact, Jesus called them Boanerges, which means sons of thunder. Again, that's not in John's Gospel. But you see that they were actually quite aggressive. They called down fire. They wanted to call down fire on a certain village. But it's marvellous how he changes through being with Jesus. Because, of course, later on in life, he wrote 1 John, how great is the love that God has lavished upon us, that we should be called children of God. And some of them are absolutely superb. All right. So, it's one of those things whereby John was not chosen because he was a great person. He was chosen because he would become a great person by the grace of God. All right, so God doesn't call us because we're great people. He calls us because he sees our potential, provided that he works in our life. It's not that we can make ourselves great, it's that he changes us. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. So that's John. It's something to think about, and also we'll see that he was very much Hebrew. We'll talk about who he was writing to as well in the next video.